police officer thought he could get away with his lies until he accused the wrong woman. Elena Carter, calm and composed, listens as the officer spins his fabricated story. But what happens when the accused is not just any woman, but a former CIA agent trained to expose deception? As the case unfolds, the truth threatens to unravel everything. Will justice prevail, or will corruption win again? What do you think? Have you ever seen someone underestimated, only to turn the tables in an unexpected way? Share your thoughts below. Now let's dive into this incredible story of deception, power, and a fight for justice. The judge's gavel struck the wooden block, sending a sharp crack through the silent courtroom. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the kind that pressed down on people's chests and made their breaths shallow. Rows of spectators leaned forward, some whispering behind cupped hands, others exchanging knowing glances. At the defendant's table sat Elena Carter, back straight, hands resting lightly on her lap, her face unreadable. The overhead lights cast a faint glow on her smooth brown skin, but her eyes remained shadowed, distant. She did not fidget, did not shift in her seat, did not look at the murmuring crowd behind her. She simply watched. Across the room, Officer Paul Simmons adjusted his tie, his uniform crisp, his posture oozing confidence. He sat at the prosecution's table, shoulders squared, eyes steady, the corners of his lips twitching into something that wasn't quite a smirk, but close enough. The judge cleared his throat. The court will now hear the case of the state versus Elena Carter. The defendant is charged with assaulting a police officer during a routine law enforcement stop. Officer Simmons, you may proceed with your testimony. Simmons rose slowly, straightening his jacket as he stepped onto the witness stand. He didn't rush. He moved with the ease of a man who believed he had already won. He took the oath, sat down, and leaned toward the microphone. It was late that night, he began, his voice even and authoritative, the practiced tone of someone who had testified more times than he could count. I was responding to a disturbance call near a closed business when I noticed the defendant, Miss Carter, standing outside. Given the circumstances, I approached her and asked what she was doing there. He paused, letting the words settle, allowing the weight of his badge and uniform to carry the narrative forward. Some members of the jury nodded, already predisposed to believe him. She immediately became aggressive, he continued, his voice carrying just the right amount of frustration. She refused to identify herself, raised her voice, and when I attempted to de-escalate the situation, she struck me in the chest. And then, he exhaled, shaking his head slightly as if recalling a difficult moment. She went for my weapon. At that point, I had no choice but to restrain her. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some people gasped softly. Others simply exchanged glances, their minds already made up. At the defense table, Elena Carter did not react. She did not flinch, did not shake her head in protest. She remained perfectly still, her gaze unwavering as she listened to Simmons craft his version of events. Jordan Hayes, her attorney, shifted uncomfortably beside her, flipping through his notes, glancing at her from the corner of his eye. But she didn't return his look. Instead, she just kept watching. Watching Simmons. Watching the jury, watching as a lie, carefully rehearsed, unfolded before her. A lie that she was waiting, just waiting, to tear apart. Simmons shifted in his seat, adjusting the microphone as he took a slow, deliberate breath. His uniform was impeccable, his badge polished to a shine, the very image of authority. He glanced toward the jury with a measured look, as if silently reinforcing what they already believed, that he was the professional, the protector, the victim. I was doing my job, he began, his voice calm, steady, practiced. It was late, close to midnight. The streets were mostly empty, and businesses had been closed for hours. That's when I saw her. He turned slightly, casting a glance at Elena. She didn't move. She barely even blinked. She was just standing there, he continued, shaking his head as though recalling something suspicious. Lurking outside a closed storefront, doing nothing, watching the street. The word lurking hung in the air. He had chosen it carefully. It wasn't illegal to stand on a sidewalk, but lurking suggested intent, something criminal, something dangerous. I approached her, identified myself, and asked her what she was doing there. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands together as if reliving a difficult memory. That's when everything escalated. He let the silence settle before going on. She became aggressive, he said, his voice taking on a note of frustration. Refused to answer my questions, refused to give me her name. I tried to keep the situation calm, but she just... He shook his head, the corners of his mouth pulling into something close to regret. She lashed out, hit me square in the chest. Before I could react, she grabbed for my weapon. There it was, the accusation that changed everything. The room was completely silent for half a beat before the murmurs started, soft, uncertain, but growing. Someone in the back let out a hushed Jesus. Simmons didn't look at Elena now. He didn't need to. His story was out there, painting the image he wanted them to see. A hostile, violent suspect. A police officer forced to defend himself. At the defense table, Jordan Hayes shifted uncomfortably, flipping through his notes as though searching for something, anything, to immediately disprove what he just heard. His jaw was tight, his grip on his pen even tighter. Elena, meanwhile, remained as she had been since the trial began. Still, composed, watching. Simmons, sensing his advantage, let out a small sigh, like a man exhausted from having to relive a traumatic event. It all happened so fast, he murmured, voice softening just enough to sound genuine. I was left with no choice but to restrain her before she could do any more harm. Another calculated pause, another glance at the jury. Jordan closed his eyes for half a second, barely perceptible, exhaling through his nose. He knew how bad this looked, and still, beside him, Elena sat there, silent. Not a single muscle in her face twitched, as if she was waiting for Simmons to finish digging his own grave. The courtroom held its breath. The weight of Officer Paul Simmons' words settled over the jury like an undeniable truth, sinking into the minds of those who had already been inclined to believe him. He sat tall on the witness stand, shoulders squared, his police badge catching the overhead lights. His uniform was crisp, his posture unwavering, the picture of a dedicated officer just trying to do his job. His gaze moved across the jury, searching for signs of agreement. He didn't have to look hard. A few jurors nodded slightly, unconsciously mirroring his conviction. This was the kind of story they had heard before. A police officer, outnumbered and under threat, forced to defend himself against a violent suspect. It was a familiar narrative, one that had played out in the headlines countless times. At the prosecutor's table, Assistant District Attorney Mark Whitmore remained still, his hands folded neatly before him. He didn't allow satisfaction to show on his face, but inside he knew Simmons was playing this perfectly. The calm authority, the measured frustration, the subtle appeal to fear. Whitmore flicked his gaze toward the defense table. Jordan Hayes wasn't as composed. Jordan's jaw was tight, his fingers gripping the pen in his hand so firmly it looked like it might snap in half. He shifted in his seat, flipping through his notes, as if searching for something, anything to counteract what had just been said. But this was bad. Simmons hadn't just given a believable testimony, he had woven a story that made sense. The sequence was clean, logical, and damning. If Jordan tried to tear it apart too soon, too aggressively, he'd look desperate. And desperate attorneys don't win over juries. He exhaled slowly through his nose, forcing himself to stay steady. He needed to wait, find the right moment. Beside him, Elena Carter sat motionless. She hadn't so much as shifted in her chair. No tension in her shoulders, no clenched fists, no flicker of protest, just stillness. Her hands remained lightly folded in her lap, her eyes locked on Simmons, unreadable. Jordan turned slightly toward her, watching her in his peripheral vision, looking for some kind of cue, a hint of unease, a glance of reassurance, anything. But Elena didn't look at him. She was watching Simmons. Not with anger, not with fear, with patience. Like she was waiting for him to make a mistake. Across the room, one of the jurors, a middle-aged man with a furrowed brow, shifted slightly in his seat. His hands clasped together in front of him, but his fingers tapped lightly against each other, a subtle, nervous gesture. It was small, barely noticeable, but Elena saw it, and for the first time since the trial began, the corners of her lips curved just barely, into something that wasn't quite a smile. The courtroom was silent, but it was the kind of silence that carried weight, heavy, unsettled. For the first time, all eyes were on Elena Carter. Up until now, she had been the still point in a storm of accusations. Letting Officer Paul Simmons talk, letting him paint his version of the truth, bold and confident, as if every word out of his mouth was undeniable. But now the moment had shifted. At the prosecution's table, Assistant District Attorney Mark Whitmore adjusted his tie, the movement slow, deliberate. His expression remained neutral, though his sharp eyes flicked toward the jury. He saw their reactions, how they had listened to Simmons, how they had nodded at his testimony. He had them. Now it was her turn. With a carefully measured tone, he asked, "Miss Carter, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Elena did not respond right away. Instead, she took a slow breath, as if considering her words carefully, and then she turned her head. Her gaze found Simmons, locking onto him like a predator studying its prey. Not angry, not defiant, just steady. And then she spoke. "If I really wanted to attack him," she said, voice calm, deliberate, "do you think he'd still be sitting here, completely unharmed?" A sharp electric hush fell over the room. Simmons stiffened. It was barely noticeable, the smallest hitch in his shoulders, the brief flicker of tension in his jaw, but Elena caught it. So did the jury. The confidence that had radiated from him just moments ago cracked ever so slightly. A few jurors exchanged glances. One of them, a middle-aged man with his hands clasped in front of him, shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly against each other, an unconscious gesture, a sign of uncertainty. Another juror, a woman in a dark blazer, jotted something down, her pen moving slower than before. At the defense table, Jordan Hayes let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned slightly, looking at Elena from the corner of his eye. She hadn't flinched, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't rushed to defend herself. She had simply let the truth settle. Whitmore's jaw tensed, his fingers curling around the edge of his legal pad. He opened his mouth, likely to dismiss her words, to steer the conversation back to the facts he wanted the jury to focus on. But for the first time, Simmons moved, a shift in his chair, a subtle clearing of his throat, a glance toward Whitmore that was just a little too quick. It was nothing, and yet it was everything. Elena saw it, and for the first time since the trial began, the corners of her lips curved, just barely, into something that wasn't quite a smile. Because this was what she had been waiting for. The first crack in his story. The first sign that Paul Simmons wasn't as sure of himself as he wanted them to believe. The silence in the courtroom stretched just a little too long. It wasn't the same silence that had followed Simmons' testimony earlier. That had been the silence of belief, of certainty. This was something different. Heavier, unsettled, doubt creeping in. Assistant District Attorney Mark Whitmore was the first to break it. He straightened slightly, adjusting his stance as if to reset the energy in the room. His voice, when he spoke again, was measured and composed, as if Elena's earlier statement hadn't rattled the case he had been meticulously building. "Miss Carter," he said, "a bold statement. But let's focus on the facts. Officer Simmons has testified that you struck him in the chest, that you reached for his weapon, that he had no choice but to restrain you. Do you deny this?" Elena didn't answer right away. She let the question sit, let the weight of it settle in the space between them. Then, finally, she turned back to Whitmore, her expression unreadable. "I deny it ever happened the way he claims," she said, her voice steady. At the defense table, Jordan Hayes exhaled slowly, gripping his pen like a lifeline. He had been waiting for this moment. Whitmore nodded slightly, as if expecting that answer. He turned toward Simmons. "Officer Simmons," he began smoothly, "you testified that the defendant physically assaulted you. Can you describe the injuries you sustained?" Simmons squared his shoulders, sitting a little straighter. "There weren't any serious injuries, per se," he admitted, his voice taking on a slightly defensive edge. "But that doesn't change the fact that she assaulted an officer. A suspect doesn't have to break a bone to be dangerous." A few jurors nodded slightly. It was a reasonable response, but not a perfect one. At the defense table, Jordan didn't smile, but he wanted to. That hesitation, that minor shift in Simmons' confidence, that was the first crack. Elena didn't react. She didn't press. She just waited. Whitmore, sensing the slight shift in tone, pressed forward. "And yet," he said, "she struck you hard enough for you to fear for your life?" A flicker of tension crossed Simmons' face. It was there and gone in an instant, but Elena saw it. "It all happened quickly," Simmons said, adjusting his seat slightly. "The adrenaline was high. I did what I was trained to do in response to an escalating situation." A well-practiced answer. But this time, it didn't land quite the same way. Whitmore nodded, but he wasn't done. "Let's talk about your body camera," he said, voice casual. "Why is there no footage of this incident?" The tension in Simmons' jaw tightened. "Unfortunately, my body cam malfunctioned during the altercation," he said. This time, the room didn't stay silent. A low murmur rippled through the spectators. It wasn't loud, it wasn't disruptive, but it was there. Jordan caught it immediately. The way the jury shifted, the subtle movements of their bodies betraying the first stirrings of doubt. Whitmore took a slow step forward, his tone now almost conversational. "Just to clarify, Officer Simmons, your body camera was working before this encounter?" "Yes." "And it was working after?" "Correct." "But during the exact moment that Miss Carter allegedly attacked you," Whitmore let the words hang in the air, making sure the jury absorbed every syllable, "it malfunctioned?" Simmons swallowed. "Too hard. Too obvious." "That's correct," he said. The jury didn't nod this time. One of the jurors, a middle-aged man who had been nodding along earlier, slowly unfolded his arms and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Another, a woman in a dark blazer, picked up her pen, hesitated, then wrote something down. From the defense table, Jordan could feel the shift. Elena saw it too. Simmons shifted again, his shoulders a little tighter, his fingers curling slightly against the wood of the witness stand. The first crack had been subtle. This one, it was spreading. The air in the courtroom stilled. It was different from the silence that had followed Simmons' testimony earlier. That had been a silence of belief, of certainty. This was the silence before a fall. Jordan Hayes exhaled slowly, pressing his hands against the defense table for just a moment before standing. His posture was different now. Gone was the hesitant, tight-jawed attorney from earlier. Now, his steps were unhurried, deliberate, the steps of a man who knew he had just been handed the match to burn everything down. "Your Honor," he said, his voice even, controlled. "The defense would like to submit a new piece of evidence, video footage taken by a bystander at the scene." A ripple of whispers surged through the courtroom like a current passing through charged air. At the prosecution's table, Mark Whitmore's head snapped toward Jordan, eyes narrowing. His case had been built carefully, brick by brick. And now this? A video? Simmons, sitting at the witness stand, went rigid. He wasn't breathing quite as easily now. "Proceed," the judge said. Jordan didn't rush. He approached the screen near the jury box, inserted a USB drive, and stepped back. The screen flickered to life. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Jordan said, his tone measured, "you have heard Officer Simmons' version of events, but now let's see what really happened." A few jurors shifted forward. One of them, the man who had nodded along with Simmons earlier, leaned in slightly, elbows on his knees. Then, the video began. The footage was shaky, taken from inside a parked car across the street, but it was clear enough. The first thing it showed, Simmons. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't cautious. He was aggressive. His stance, his body language, it wasn't that of an officer encountering a threat. It was that of a man asserting control. "What are you doing here?" Simmons' voice crackled through the speakers. "Walking home," Elena's voice replied, steady. "I need to see some ID." "Why?" "Because I said so." A murmur moved through the room. Then came the next part. Simmons stepped in too close. His body language turned hostile. "Women like you need to learn how to listen," he said. Gasps. Real, audible gasps. Jordan paused the video. Every set of eyes in the room snapped to Simmons. The officer's jaw tightened. His fingers curled slightly against the edge of the stand. Jordan turned to face him. "Officer Simmons," he said, "would you like to explain that remark?" Simmons opened his mouth, but nothing came out. One of the jurors rubbed his temple. Another, a woman in a dark blazer, picked up her pen, hesitated, then began scribbling something down. Jordan let the silence stretch, let Simmons sit in it. Then he pressed play. And that was when it unraveled. Simmons grabbed Elena first, not the other way around. His hand closed around her wrist, yanking her forward. Elena pulled back, not fighting, not attacking, just trying to free herself. Then, the shove. Simmons shoved her first. Elena stumbled against the wall of the building, her hands raised, palms open, surrendering. And then Simmons reached for his weapon. The video paused on that exact frame. For a second, no one moved. Then, the courtroom erupted. Murmurs, sharp inhales, heads shaking in disbelief. A low hum of shock spread like wildfire. One juror, the same man who had nodded along with Simmons earlier, sat back, exhaling slowly. The woman in the dark blazer set her pen down and folded her arms. At the prosecution's table, Whitmore's face had gone rigid. He wasn't looking at Jordan. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at Simmons. And Simmons, he looked small. The officer stared at the frozen image of himself on the screen. The gun in his hand, the truth laid bare for all to see. His fingers tightened on the stand like it was the only thing keeping him upright. For the first time since the trial began, the power in the room shifted. Simmons had been in control. Now, Elena was. The courtroom hung in suspension, the air thick with something unspoken. The jury, once composed and assured, now sat uneasy, shifting slightly in their seats. Their belief had cracked. They had watched the video. They had seen the truth. But even then, Whitmore wasn't ready to let go. The seasoned prosecutor adjusted his tie, masking the tightness in his jaw. He stepped forward, addressing the jury with the measured calm of a man trying to regain lost ground. This video, he began, his tone firm but coaxing, shows an altercation, yes, but let's not forget, Officer Simmons was acting in the interest of public safety. In his mind, Miss Law, Carter presented a potential threat. It is possible, entirely possible, that he perceived her actions as hostile, that he feared for his safety. A final play. An attempt to plant just enough doubt that Simmons' actions could still be justified. Jordan was about to object, to dismantle Whitmore's flimsy defense. But Elena moved first. She stood, slow, purposeful, controlled. Not a defendant, not anymore. For the first time since the trial began, she turned, fully, to face the jury. Feared for his safety? Her voice wasn't loud, but it carved through the tension like a blade. Simmons visibly tensed. "You want to talk about danger?" Elena continued, stepping away from the defense table. Not toward the stand, not toward Simmons, but toward the truth that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. "I have spent my life in danger." The first whispers rippled through the gallery. But Elena didn't stop. "I have been trained to neutralize threats in high-risk environments. I have been deployed in active combat zones. I have stood in places where hesitation meant death." She let the words settle. Then she turned her gaze onto Simmons. "I was a Navy SEAL." The courtroom detonated. Gasps, stunned disbelief. A chair scraped loudly as one of the jurors shifted. Someone in the gallery murmured, "No way." Simmons flinched. Elena wasn't finished. She took a step closer. And after that, her voice was controlled, steady, but her eyes never left Simmons. "I worked for the CIA." The reaction was instantaneous. A woman in the jury box inhaled sharply, dropping her pen onto the table. A man near the back of the room folded his arms, expression unreadable, his jaw tight. Even Judge Grayson, who had maintained an air of strict impartiality throughout the trial, tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharpening. Elena let the chaos unfold around her, but she never broke eye contact with Simmons. "My job," she continued, her voice a quiet force, "was to investigate those who abused their power, men like Officer Simmons." The color drained from his face. Whitmore closed his eyes for half a second. He had lost. He knew it. This trial had never been about Elena Carter, the defendant. It was now about Elena Carter, the highly trained operative who had spent her career taking men like Simmons down. And Simmons knew it too. For the first time, he looked truly afraid. The courtroom had shifted. It was no longer a trial about a police officer's testimony against a defendant. It was a battlefield. Elena Carter wasn't just standing there anymore. She was in control now. And Simmons was trapped. He sat stiffly on the witness stand, his hands gripping the armrests as though they were the only things keeping him grounded. His body had betrayed him long before his words would. Elena saw it all, the subtle clench of his jaw, The flicker of his fingers against the wood, the slight involuntary glance toward the prosecution's table, as if looking for an escape. There wasn't one. She took a slow step forward, measured, predatory. "Officer Simmons," she said, her voice smooth, even. He straightened, squaring his shoulders. A forced show of confidence. "Yes, let's go back to your testimony." She let the words settle. "You stated that I lunged at you, that I struck you in the chest before attempting to grab your weapon." "That's correct. And yet, the video evidence we just watched," she tilted her head slightly, "tells a different story. Wouldn't you agree?" Simmons' fingers twitched. He cleared his throat. "The video doesn't show everything. I was reacting in the moment to what I perceived as a threat." Elena's lips curved slightly. "Interesting." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Because before, you said you were attacked without provocation, that I struck you, unprompted. But now it was about what you perceived?" A few members of the jury shifted. Elena took another step closer. Simmons leaned back. "You're changing your story, Officer Simmons." No, I'm not." But his breathing had changed, shorter, shallower. Elena studied him, her dark eyes calculating. "You're nervous." The words were quiet, almost too quiet. Simmons' eyebrows furrowed. "Excuse me?" She took another step. "You're sitting differently than before. Your shoulders are tighter. Your hands," she flicked her gaze downward, "were steady earlier. Now you're gripping the stand like it's keeping you afloat." The jury was watching now. Simmons shifted, realizing too late that adjusting his grip only made it worse. Elena nodded, as if she had already expected it. "It's a natural response. When someone is caught in a lie, their body betrays them before their mouth does." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. "I'm not lying," Simmons snapped. But his tone was wrong, too sharp, too defensive. "Then let's talk about your body camera," Elena continued, her tone never wavering. She circled slightly, giving the jury a full view of Simmons as she spoke. "You claimed it malfunctioned at the exact moment of our interaction. It worked before. It worked after. But in those few critical seconds, it just so happened to stop recording?" Simmons' throat bobbed as he swallowed. It was a technical failure." Elena raised an eyebrow. "A coincidence, then?" Simmons didn't answer, and in that moment, he didn't need to, because the jury could see it. His body, his hesitation, his breathing. Elena had spent years interrogating men who thought they could lie, and Simmons was no different. The air in the courtroom had thickened, pressing down like an invisible weight. Simmons felt it. It was in the way the jury no longer met his gaze, the way their pens had stilled, their hands now resting tensely on the table. It was in the way the prosecution's table sat frozen, unmoving, distant. The video had shattered the first illusion. Elena's words had shattered the rest. And now he was drowning. Simmons squared his shoulders, forcing himself to sit up straighter. His palms were damp where they gripped the armrests, but he fought the urge to wipe them against his uniform. "Look," he started, his voice thinner than before, missing its former confidence. "I was doing my job. I was responding to a potential threat. I didn't know who she was." His eyes flickered to the jury, searching for anything, anyone who still believed him. There was nothing. No nods, no reassuring glances, just silence. Elena tilted her head slightly. "And if you had known?" The words landed with force. Though her voice remained unbearably calm, Simmons hesitated. "Just a second too long. I mean, it wouldn't have changed how I handled the situation." "Really?" The single word cut through the stillness like a blade. "Because earlier, you said you reacted the way you did out of fear, that you felt threatened, that you thought you were dealing with someone dangerous." Elena took a step closer, slow, deliberate, measured. Simmons leaned back slightly. "So tell me, Officer Simmons, if you had known that I was a decorated Navy SEAL, if you had known that I was CIA, if you had known that I have spent my career tracking men who abuse their power." She let the words settle, heavy in the air. Then she delivered the final blow. "Would you still have tried to frame me?" Simmons's breath hitched. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time, his body betrayed him before his words did. His fingers curled too tightly around the edge of the stand. A bead of sweat slid down the side of his face. His leg tensed involuntarily, as if every nerve in his body was preparing to run. He could feel them watching. The jury, the judge, the spectators, all waiting, all seeing him now. Not as a lawman, not as a victim, but as something smaller. Simmons swallowed hard. I didn't frame anyone. A lie. And everyone knew it. He turned, desperate now, toward the prosecution's table. Toward Mark Whitmore, his last hope. But Whitmore wasn't looking at him anymore. The prosecutor sat still, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his jaw locked, not in support, not in defense, but in detachment. He had already abandoned ship. Simmons' stomach twisted. He tried to breathe, but the room felt too hot, too tight. His badge suddenly felt like an anchor, dragging him down. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. For the first time since the trial began, he was truly, completely alone. The air in the courtroom was dense, charged with something unspoken. The weight of the past few days, the testimonies, the revelations, the unraveling of truth, hung heavy over everyone. And now, it all came down to this. Judge Grayson's gaze swept across the room before settling on the forewoman of the jury. A woman in her late 50s, poised but firm. She hadn't taken her eyes off Simmons since the video played. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The forewoman stood slowly, the folded slip of paper gripped between her fingers. "Yes, Your Honor." A hush settled over the room. The moments stretched, taut as a wire. Even the courtroom air felt heavier, as if holding its breath, waiting. Finally, the words came. "We find the defendant, Elena Carter, not guilty." The silence shattered. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The press leaned forward, pens poised. A juror exhaled sharply, as if realizing only now that he'd been holding his breath. At the defense table, Jordan Hayes let out a slow breath of his own. He didn't smile, not yet, but his fingers relaxed against the tabletop, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. Elena? She was still. She had expected this. Knew justice was on her side, but that didn't mean she had forgotten how close she had come to losing everything. Judge Grayson nodded once. His attention shifted, toward Simmons. The weight in the air shifted again. "In light of new evidence," the judge continued, his voice steady, "Officer Paul Simmons is hereby remanded into custody for perjury and obstruction of justice." The statement landed like a hammer. Simmons jerked slightly in his seat. For a fleeting second, his face twisted. Shock, disbelief, something dangerously close to fear. Then came the sound. The clinking of handcuffs. The uniformed bailiff moved swiftly, securing Simmons' wrists behind his back. The metallic snap echoed louder than it should have. Or maybe it only felt that way. Simmons' breath shuddered out. The badge he had once worn so proudly, now it was nothing. Just a memory. He tried to speak, tried to say something, anything. But when his gaze darted toward the prosecution's table, Whitmore wasn't looking at him. The prosecutor sat rigid, hands clasped, jaw locked. He had fought this case like it was airtight. And now? Now, he looked as though he wanted nothing more than to distance himself from the man he had just lost everything for. Simmons' throat bobbed as he swallowed. The reality of it hit him in waves. He was done. As the officers led him away, Elena watched. Not in satisfaction, not in anger. Just watched. Because this wasn't victory. This was justice. And justice should have never taken this long. Outside, the courthouse loomed behind her. The moment she stepped through the doors, the city breathed again. Cameras flashed, reporters called her name, voices swirled, questions, exclamations, half-formed headlines in the making. But Elena kept walking. The battle was over, or at least this one was. And then, a voice, low, controlled, purposeful. "Miss Carter." She didn't stop, but her steps slowed. A man stood near the curb, away from the press, watching her with the kind of quiet intensity that spoke of purpose. He wasn't media, wasn't law enforcement, but he was waiting for her. Elena said nothing, just looked. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a small business card. "Impressive work in there," he said, offering it to her. "You might be interested in another case, something bigger, something systemic." The words settled between them. Elena took the card, not eagerly, not hastily, just steadily. Her fingers ran over the edges, feeling the weight of what this meant. She had spent years chasing justice, and justice had always been a moving target. She lifted her gaze. "Tell me more." The doors to the courthouse groaned shut behind her. The sound was final. but justice never was. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to show your support, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. Your engagement helps us continue creating meaningful content, stories that inspire, challenge, and shine a light on truth. Every like, share, and subscription fuels our mission to bring you more. So what do you think? Was this justice or just the beginning of something bigger? Let us know in the comments below.